Introduce myself. I've been a resin caster for several years now at this point. I do demos do demos a lot, kind of teaching everybody and giving them the basics. What we're going to do tonight is we're going to do just a block mold with a P-Town subby mold. It's a HDPE mold. You can make one out of there's several different ways you can make one. You can make one out of chloroplast board that will work one time. You can make one out of melamine that'll last 2 or 3 times, or I prefer either making one out of HDPE or buying one. I get mine at ptownsubby.com. ptownsubby.com. It's a guy named Fred Wisson. He's used to be one of the head guys on the sub for like 19 years. But he does his, they're CNC'd, so it's a perfect fit and they don't leak. The ones that I made out of cutting boards leaked a lot, so I started buying Fred stuff, 5-6 years ago at this point. There are several different resins that you can use, and certain ones work better for certain areas, and we'll kind of go over that today. But this is just a really basic way to get you into resin casting. If you have any questions, please feel free to just yell at me. I will most likely, once I get started, not be looking up because I have a habit of spilling stuff. So, yeah, you guys are in the splash zone. But before I get started, do you guys have any questions or anything?
Do you find that aluminite is the best one that you're using for your casting?
So I actually love, so we'll take that and go right into it. So there's 3 main types of resin. There's polyester resin, there is alumilite, which is a polyurethane resin, and then there's an epoxy resin. When it comes to epoxy resins, you need to be very conscious with which ones you're getting, because there is a difference between tabletop epoxies and the ones that allow you to cast thicker. Tabletop epoxies only allow you to cast up to like 1/8 of an inch or a little bit more at a time. If you take a tabletop epoxy and pour a mold 1 inch thick, you guys are going to see some chemical reactions. It'll boil, it'll get hot, it'll crack, it'll do all sorts of stuff. With polyester resin is a very cost-effective resin, okay? It has a catalyst called MEKP, which activates it. It's great for just pure color casting. It does not require a pressure pot. As it cures, it actually shrinks on itself, which reduces the bubbles. The thing about polyester resin is it requires a lot of ventilation. So if you are casting with it, you need to make sure you're like in the edge of your garage with the door open and a fan blowing out. You can't cast it inside your house, or I always recommend the guys up north are always casting in their basements, not in your basement. That's the thing about polyester resin, but it's actually a really great resin for all color blanks. As far as hybrids go, hybrids being you're casting with worthless wood or prickly pear or cholla cactus, anything. There's guys that do Legos and all that stuff. Alumilite I have found is the best. Alumilite clear. Okay, there is a difference between alumilite clear and alumilite clear cast. Alumilite clear cast is the 2-part epoxy you get at Hobby Lobby. Alumilite clear was designed by Curtis Seebeck at turntex.com or Turntex. Curtis is the guy that does cactus juice stabilizing resin. He actually helped formulate what we use as clear and clear slow, specifically for blank making for pin turning and bowl turning and bottle stoppers and everything we do. Yes, sir.
It's different than what he sells, the cactus juice?
Cactus juice is a stabilizing resin. Okay. So correct. Stabilizing is impregnating the wood with and then taking it out and heating it up and curing it, and that's a vacuum chamber. So maybe I should start there. So there's a difference between resin casting and stabilizing, okay? Stabilizing, I'm going to butcher this, so when Curtis sees it, he's going to shake his head. But stabilizing is when you take a vacuum chamber, you fill it full of resin or cactus juice, and then you drop your piece of wood in with a weight, and it's fully submerged. You then hook up a vacuum to it. What you're going to notice is the wood's going to bubble because you're actually removing the oxygen from the wood. Once it stops bubbling, you equalize the pressure, and all the open membranes of that wood that were oxygen that were sucked out are going to suck in the resin. You then remove it, bake it for 220 or 220 degrees for however long, and then you've injected that piece of wood with resin, which has made it solid. So it's really great to do with punky woods or soft woods.
So, just to clarify, so when it comes out of the vacuum pot, it's still liquid?
Correct. That's when you have to take it, wrap it in foil, and put it in an oven to cure it. With resin casting, you're actually you're just taking the resin, clear resin. We're using a colorant like you can use the pigment dyes, or you can use mica, which is what we'll be using tonight. And you're casting a block with it, so it's all resin. When you do a hybrid cast, you're taking kind of both of those. You're doing a wood or Legos or anything you could imagine mixing. Guys do beads or anything. And then you also have epoxies. There's several epoxies out there. Liquid diamonds, oil palm resin's a new one that's kind of getting some traction. There's several. Alumilite clear cast is a great one as well. Those are good for clear casting. So if you guys ever see, like, the Sweetheart grips were famous in World War II, but it's basically a picture of your loved one and then they clear cast it. Anytime you're doing like an image casting on a tube for a pen, I recommend an epoxy resin. Okay. The only difference is with epoxy resin is you have to stir. It's about 5 to 7 minutes of direct stirring before it's mixed well enough. 99% of issues when casting with epoxy resins is because they weren't stirred well enough. With Alumilite, Alumilite's a very great product, a very versatile product. We're going to stir it tonight, and I'll show you guys that as well. And then with polyester resin, that's the same thing with polyester resin. Polyester resin, you're constantly stirring because you're wanting to get a good blend of the MEKP once it's activated. If you don't stir it well enough, what you'll do is you'll have a soft spot in the blank. So if you've ever turned a pen blank or a blank and it's pretty consistent except for like one nickel size, you get two little ends that are real soft, but everything else is great. It's because they just didn't quite stir it enough.
What about art resin?
Art resin, I would have to look into, but I'm pretty confident that is an epoxy resin.
Hey, Brian, what's the difference between the clear and the clear slow, other than
So time is a factor in that, but Alumilite Clear Slow was created for larger casts. It takes longer to cure because it doesn't get as hot, because it reduces the chances of heat fracturing due to the size of it. Alumilite Slow was not meant to give you more time as a caster to get it in the pot. It's actually seconds different timing-wise that you have to mix it up. So if you guys are just doing pen blanks or smaller projects, I definitely recommend Alumilite Clear. I have a little bit different way of casting, which I'm going to show you guys. It gives you all the time you need, so you're not in a rush, okay? And we can start right now, and I'll even go into why I use some things. So most of you guys probably don't know me or heard of me, but I'm in the Pen Blanks Resin Casting group on Facebook. It's Pen Blanks Resin Casting. If you guys are on Facebook, I definitely recommend you join it. There are lots of great casters on there, and it's just a group of, I think we just passed 6,000 members, and there's a wealth of knowledge. You have mold makers and mica dealers and resin guys. I mean, it's kind of like a wealth of knowledge and a place that, as a resin caster, you can go to for any tips, tricks, or advice. I'm known as under the hashtag The Casting Kid. Is kind of what I'm known for on Facebook. But long story short, I cast with polyester resin, Alumilite, and epoxy resins every week. I cast with all three. So that's why I use paper cups, okay? These are all paper cups. They're made for hot stuff like coffee. You do not want to use the wax-based cups, which are cold paper cups, like the Dixie cups. With epoxy and polyester resin, you definitely need the paper cups. With Alumilite, if you read the manufacturers, they recommend you use a clear cup because when you stir it, once you've stirred it well enough, it goes clear again. It turns foggy and then it goes clear. However, since we're adding mica in, you won't see that effect anyway, so might as well just stick with the paper cups. What will happen if you use the plastic cups on the polyester resin, the MEKP will eat through it and it'll literally melt the cup in your hand. With the epoxies get really hot up to 130 degrees, it'll melt the cup. So that's why I recommend the paper cup. Yes, sir. Oh, yeah. So we'll take, I don't know where my view is. I think I moved my mold. Told you guys, I spill all sorts of stuff. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to cast a block mold. I'll do 3 colors just because it kind of gives a beautiful effect. We're just going to hit the basics. So I know that 7/8 to an inch, which is right there, thick, is about 600 grams. It's really about 520 is all you need, but I like to spill. So we're going to go with 600 just in case. So, do 3 colors, so it's 200 grams of each. Alumilite clear is a 50-50 ratio or 1-to-1, so it's 100 grams A and 100 grams B. So it becomes kind of easier for me to remember it, especially while I'm demoing because I kind of forget.
Does the mica weigh much?
The mica weighs 1 gram full is 20, one jar of this full is 21 grams of mica. So it's not very heavy. But that's actually a great question. So if we do 100 grams of resin of part A in here, and we introduce 10 grams of mica into each one, you still only need 100 grams of B. Okay, so it's resin to resin. Whatever you mix into it does not go into effect. So we're just going to top these off to 100 grams. This is 1-to-1 ratio, so the closer you get to 1-to-1 is the best you're going to get. There is a little bit of room for error, so if you're at 51%, 49%, it's not the end of the world. However, I would recommend the goal is to always get as close to 1-to-1 as possible. Yes, definitely going to need a scale. They are not the same densities. So it actually says it on the bottle, although I went to Garland School, so I don't really like reading all the instructions.
Okay, Gary, cut it out.
So, yeah, who needs directions? You only need directions once you're lost. And then you just find where the sun is. Right. It's called an accidental adventure. Okay, so now that I've poured my part A, I always set it aside so I don't mix it up. You only get the reaction to activate alumilite when you mix A and A together and B and B or A and B together. If you mix A and A together or if you mix B and B together, it will not cure. Okay? I've got to say it. So, how do I know that? There's plenty of stories. Plenty of stories. So, what I'll do now is I'll actually take my mica and I will color the part A. Okay? Now keep in mind, every resin caster is different, and that's what makes it great, is because we can all together cast blanks with the same colors, and they'll all together come out different. It goes to many different factors. You can use a little bit of mica and some tint. You can use just a little bit of mica. I like to use a lot of mica. I'm a pen guy. I make a lot of pens. So I turn my projects real thin. So the more mica you put in, the less opportunity for it to be transparent.
And the tinting is the alumilite dye, right?
Correct. Yep. So when you introduce your mica, keep in mind that you're putting in enough for double, because you're about to introduce another 100 grams of resin to it once you've stirred in your mica. You still have 100 grams of part B.
Approximately how much mica do you think you're using?
I have no idea. Acrylic paints, as long as they're not water-based, will work. So enamel-based, I believe it is, will work, but a little goes a long way. As far as the mica goes, I will show you ways. I've been doing this a long time, so I kind of just have a feel for it. But I'll show you guys a tip once we start stirring to find out whether or not you have enough or not.
So what else can you use for dye?
So alcohol-based you can use. You know, Alumilite dyes are great. There's a guy named Braxton Frankenberry with Divine Pigments that has pigments that you can add on. You can use several things. I personally like mica because it sparkles.
Do you ever use turquoise or any other mineral?
I've only ever introduced turquoise into my castings one time and found out it's a pain to turn. So So we're really not too worried about stirring thoroughly right now. I just like to get a good mix just to make sure there's not any major powder for when we introduce our bee.
So you're all-based India ink in the various colors. Generally has a little bit of shellac. Does that give you a problem?
I would have no idea. I'd have to try it. I mean, you know, it's one of those I kind of always recommend, you know, kind of the home brand names or the Alumilite dyes if you are going to get into it. They're actually only, I believe, like $4 or $5 a piece, so it's not like they're the bank, you know, going to break the bank. Another thing to remember when doing dyes, especially if you're on a budget, same thing with micas, is you can always mix two colors to create another one, okay? It's like back to a kindergarten kind of deal where red and yellow makes orange and blue and yellow makes green, and that kind of back to the basics. So if you're on a budget, you can always kind of do that.